values rural stories and voices and aims to create understanding between the urban and the rural. Rural stories are rarely captured by large audiences, and rural diversity, resilience, experiences, and revitalization are often overlooked. Living in a time of global interconnection, decisions made in urban centers have a large impact on the rural life in Ontario, and it's important to recognize the impact these decisions may have on rural communities, making rural stories extremely relevant today. The People's Archive of Rural Ontario is an accessible place where rural stories can be shared and where everyday people can tell everyday stories about their lives in and around rural Ontario. PARO stories are published in the virtual archive, and stories include audio-visual and written content and highlight diverse perspectives across different cultures, socioeconomic statuses, races, sexual orientations, and beliefs. As a PARO story curator, I've been specifically focusing on Black rural experiences. As a young Black woman from majority white suburbs, it's been a really amazing experience to learn about rural Black stories. And I've had the opportunity to write 2 stories as my time as a curator. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dorothy Wright Wallace and was fortunate to be able to hear about the rural and urban community connections in her family's life. So the story discusses Dorothy's family and their time in the Chatham Township, the family's move to the city, and Dorothy's connection with the rural community and farming. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the story now. Chatham Township and the city of Chatham are part of the Chatham-Kent area and is home to many Black farmers and farm laborers. The Wright family and their daughter, Dorothy Wright Wallace, experienced both areas, the rural and the urban. The Black community were essential contributors to farming in Chatham Township, and once Dorothy's family moved into the city of Chatham, working the land, strong community ties, and rural values continued to be important parts of their lives. Dorothy's parents, Arthur Wright on the left and Margaret Snooks on the right, were born in Canada and were married in 1921 and had 9 children. Her mother's family, the Snooks, owned a well-known store in the Chatham area, and her father's family, the Wrights, came to Canada from Pennsylvania, fleeing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, changing their name from Harmon to Wright. Dorothy suspects this change was because the name Harmon was that of a previous slaveholder. Her family's history is an important connection for her, as Dorothy states, "There's something about getting that information that makes me understand who I am, why I am who I am, and answers a lot of questions." The Wrights lived in the Chatham Township and rented a small house on a farmer's land. They were surrounded by both Black and white farming families who owned large lots of land and grew crops and like wheat and sugar beets, sold produce, and raised animals. Dorothy's father, a World War I veteran, worked as a farm laborer on those farms, plowing fields and blocking or thinning sugar beets and picking tomatoes. Dorothy's mother also blocked sugar beets and picked tomatoes when she could. She is remembered for the pies she made during threshing season in the summer. The Black rural community of Chatham Township would gather then. The men threshed the wheat and oats, and the women cooked lunch and dinner. Dorothy's mother was in charge of pies, making upwards of 13 pies for men to eat during breaks. Dorothy's family moved into the city of Chatham after their house burnt down. Even after Dorothy was born in 1943 in the city, her family maintained a connection with farming. They visited family and friends who lived in the country whenever they could. Dorothy recalls a farmer who would bring his fresh vegetables on a horse-drawn wagon into Chatham and drive around the neighborhood selling his produce. The women in the neighborhood would rush out of their houses to purchase his fresh vegetables, like tomatoes and beets. Dorothy also spent time at a family friend's property called Uncle Allen, who had an acre of land just on the outskirts of the city. Growing up, Dorothy would spend time on his land where he had ducks, chickens, and hunting dogs, and she would help pick dandelions from his fields. Dorothy remembers how it wasn't out of the ordinary for her parents to come home with a chicken, butcher it, and tell young Dorothy to go find it once it stopped fluttering. "That's the kind of upbringing I had," said Dorothy. "Farming was something very important and has always been a part of who I am." So I hope you enjoyed the excerpt from that story. I thoroughly enjoyed getting to know Dorothy and her story. The next story that I curated for Paro is about Kaya Farms and Market Garden, which is owned and run by Chris Prince and Amy Johnson in North Buxton. So I'm going to read you a little bit of that story now. The story talks about the creation of the farm and the market garden and Chris and Amy's efforts to introduce sustainable, locally grown produce into their community. What started as a place for healing has now become a flourishing business that challenges ideas about farming and takes responsibility for future generations. Chris and Amy's passion for community, sustainability, and gardening on their farm is helping them achieve their goal of becoming a healthier farming family and, in the process, rejuvenating the idea of self-sufficiency in their rural community. Kaya Farms and Market Garden, located in North Buxton, is owned and run by Chris Prince and Amy Johnson. The pair first started gardening and healing after the stillbirth of their daughter, Kaya, in 2017. At first, they gave away or traded the extra produce, sharing with the community. Then in 2020, they officially launched Kaya Farms and Market Garden, named after their daughter. Since then, they've continued to provide their community with local, fresh, and sustainably grown flowers, plants, and vegetables. Chris Prince comes from a long history of Black families who have been living and farming in North Buxton for well over 100 years. Chris, his father, his brother, and his sister continue to farm the land their family has held for 7 generations. He feels very fortunate to still have the farm and thankful for his ancestors' hard work to sustain it through difficult periods such as the 30s and the 80s, when many others in North Buxton lost their farms. The Prince family farm now consists of 1,000 acres. Chris's partner, Amy Johnson, comes from Walpole Island First Nation Reserves, which is 45 minutes from Buxton, where she grew up on the land gardening, hunting, and fishing. Chris and Amy are both passionate about land stewardship and work extremely hard to implement natural and sustainable practices into Kaya Farms. Starting the farm and market garden has also reintroduced the idea of increasing food self-sufficiency within the North Buxton community. People in the North Buxton community formerly grew their own food, worked together, and shared their bounty. And since starting Kaya Farms, Chris and Amy have been able to get people more invested in growing their own food again. People who originally started buying vegetables from the farm have now started buying seeds to start their own gardens. And Chris and Amy are happy to help people create their own gardens and have even started doing workshops at the First Nations community on Walpole Island. So I hope those stories gave you a bit of an idea about what the People's Archive of Rural Ontario does to highlight rural stories and voices. And I'm thankful to be able to continue my experience writing stories for the People's Archive of Rural Ontario. Next, I'm hoping to write about the Queens Bush settlement in Wellington County and Emancipation Day celebrations in Owen Sound. So Paro is always looking for new story submissions. If you identify yourself, your community, or your interests as rural, then your story has a place in Paro. Thank you so much.